Whoopi Goldberg spent decades not knowing where she came from. She invented a surname, inherited a Caribbean origin story she could never verify, and built one of the most recognizable identities in American entertainment on a foundation she herself admitted was largely guesswork. Then a DNA test dismantled the guesswork entirely. What the results revealed reached back thousands of years and raised a question about identity that no laboratory has yet been able to answer. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. She did not grow up with a homeland. No grandmother stories about a village. No father tracing a finger across a map. No surname that pointed anywhere real. Karen Elaine Johnson was born in 1955 in a Chelsea housing project, raised by a mother doing it mostly alone, and the past simply was not something the family had access to. Not because no one cared, because the thread had been cut long before any of them were born. The name Whoopi Goldberg came later, and it came by design. Whoopi from a nickname, Goldberg because her mother believed practically that it would help. The entertainment industry of the early 1980s had its preferences and its gatekeepers, and Emma Johnson had watched long enough to know how the game worked. Her daughter took the name, kept it through stand-up clubs and Broadway, and an Oscar and 30 years of public life, and never pretended it was anything other than what it was, a choice, not an inheritance. What she could not choose was an origin. For most of her life, she held on to the idea that her family had come through the Caribbean at some point. It was not an invention exactly. It was the kind of assumption that circulates in African American families across the urban Northeast, where migration routes crossed, records thinned out, and somebody's elder once mentioned an island, and the detail stuck. Plausible enough to repeat and impossible to confirm. She said so publicly, without drama. No performed grief, no theatrical longing for roots she could not name. Just a clear-eyed admission that she did not know where her family came from and had made a kind of peace with that. That honesty is easy to pass over, but it matters because it says something about what the DNA results would eventually mean to her. Not a shattering revelation, not an identity crisis, but a door swinging open in a wall she had quietly stopped expecting to move. The wall itself was not hers alone. Millions of African American families had stood in front of the same one. Understanding why it existed is the only way to understand what breaking through it actually meant. The 1870 census is where most African American family trees stopped growing. Not because the family stopped existing, but because before that line, the record stopped seeing them as people. Prior to emancipation, the U.S. Census recorded enslaved individuals in separate slave schedules. No names, no Bureau of Places, no family relationships. Just a column of ages, a column of sexes, and a single number representing their assessed value to someone else. Ancestry, in any meaningful sense, was not considered worth documenting. That erasure was not accidental. Slavery as an institution depended on the severing of lineage. Families were separated at auction. Children were sold away from mothers. Surnames, when they existed at all, belonged to owners and changed whenever ownership did. The oral histories that survived did so against considerable odds, passed in whispers, carried across state lines, kept alive by people who had every reason to forget and chose not to. But memory has limits. By the third and fourth generation after emancipation, the specific details blur. An ancestor becomes a region becomes a rumor becomes a family story that everyone repeats and nobody can trace. The Caribbean narrative that Goldberg carried is a version of this, not fabricated, but eroded, worn down by time and distance from whatever original truth it once contained. The Freedmen's Bureau records created after the Civil War were meant to help. In some cases they did, capturing names and locations and family connections that the census had never bothered with. But the Bureau was underfunded, short-lived, and uneven in its coverage. Entire states have gaps. Entire communities left no trace in its files. For families like Goldberg's, the documentary record runs out long before it reaches anything resembling an origin point. That is the wall, not a metaphor, a structural historical fact built from 2 centuries of deliberate omission. Documents were never going to get past it. The only tool capable of reaching to the other side was one that didn't exist until recently. And it works not by reading paper records, but by reading something far older. In 2006, Henry Louis Gates Jr. stood in front of a camera and asked a question that no historian had ever been able to answer with any precision. Where exactly did African Americans come from? Not in the broad sense, that much was understood, but specifically by region, by ethnic group, by the particular communities whose members had been loaded onto ships and carried across the Atlantic. Gates believed DNA could get closer to an answer than any document ever had. The result was a PBS documentary series called African American Lives, and Whoopi Goldberg was among its participants. The methodology Gates's team used was not a consumer ancestry kit. It was a research-grade genetic analysis combining mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome testing where applicable, and autosomal DNA to build a layered picture of ancestry across multiple lines. The African database they worked against had been assembled specifically for the project, drawing on genetic samples from populations across sub-Saharan Africa to allow comparisons that commercial tests at the time could not make. When Goldberg's results came back, the Caribbean theory didn't survive the first page. Her African ancestry traced not to any island population, but directly to the continent, and not to a single region. The results identified genetic affiliations with multiple distinct West and Central African populations spread across what are now several different countries. The picture that emerged was not a single point of origin, but a confluence, different lines, different peoples, different histories, all present in one person sitting in a television studio, waiting to hear her own story read back to her. What the results could not do was rank those connections with certainty. Genetic ancestry analysis at the population level deals in probabilities, not absolutes. A match to a particular ethnic group means a statistically significant similarity, not a confirmed genealogical line. Gates was careful about this on camera, and the distinction matters. The DNA was pointing at specific places on the map. It was not handing over names or dates or a confirmed family tree. It was, however, pointing more precisely than anything that had come before, and some of what it pointed to carried a history far weightier than a percentage on a chart. The Papel and the Bijago are not names that appear in most history books written outside West Africa. That absence is itself a kind of distortion. These were not marginal peoples living at the edges of events. They occupied the islands and coastal lowlands of what is now Guinea-Bissau, a small nation wedged between Senegal and Guinea on the Atlantic coast. And they had been there long enough to develop distinct languages, spiritual systems, and political structures entirely their own. The Bijago, in particular, had a reputation the Portuguese found difficult to manage. Their island homeland gave them a natural defensive advantage, shallow channels, difficult navigation, terrain that favored people who knew it. Portuguese slave raiders who operated along the West African coast in the 16th and 17th centuries learned, often at considerable cost, that the Bijago were not easily taken. They raided back. They attacked vessels. They maintained a resistance that lasted longer than most coastal peoples managed against the weight of European maritime power. That resistance did not hold forever. No resistance did. Through a combination of interethnic conflict, Portuguese military pressure, and the economic machinery of the slave trade that turned neighbor against neighbor across the entire region, people from Guinea-Bissau did eventually enter the Atlantic trade, carried primarily toward Brazil and in smaller numbers toward North America. The routes were specific, the ports documented, the numbers counted by the people doing the counting for their own commercial purposes. When Goldberg's DNA flagged a genetic affiliation with the Papal and Bijago peoples, it was connecting her not just to a coordinate on a map, but to that entire weight of history, a community that resisted, a coast that was raided anyway, a people whose descendants ended up scattered across the Atlantic world in ways no one among them chose. That connection does not answer every question. Genetic similarity to a present-day population is not a direct genealogical certificate. The science is precise in what it claims and honest about its limits, but it places her inside a specific human story, and that story, once you know it, is not easy to set aside. The African ancestry results were striking. What came alongside them was harder to sit with. A portion of Goldberg's genome traced to European origins. Not a trace amount, not a rounding error, a substantial percentage consistent with what Gates's team was finding across nearly every African American participant in the series. The number varied person to person, but the pattern was consistent enough to constitute but its own kind of finding. European DNA had entered African American bloodlines at scale, and the historical explanation for how that happened is not complicated, even if it remains deeply uncomfortable. Slavery in the American South created conditions in which enslaved women had no legal standing to refuse the men who owned them. Rape was not a crime when the victim was property. Children born from those encounters were classified as enslaved regardless of their parentage, inheriting their mother's status under laws designed specifically to ensure that the system reproduced itself. The white ancestry present in so many African American genomes today is, in the majority of cases, a direct genetic record of that. Not ancient history in the abstract, a biological inheritance from specific acts of violence that were legal, commonplace, and deliberately unacknowledged. Goldberg received this information on camera. She did not perform shock, did not look away, did not offer the kind of emotional response that makes for easier television. What she gave instead was something quieter, a recognition that this was always part of the story, that anyone who had thought honestly about African American history had always known some version of this was there. The DNA was simply making visible what had been rendered invisible by design. What the results could not do was name anyone. The European ancestors in her genome left no paper trail that connects to her. No surname, no county, no plantation record that closes the distance between a genetic percentage and a specific person. They shaped her in ways that are measurable, who they were and what they did, and whether anyone in their own families ever acknowledged what they left behind, that remains exactly as buried as it was before the test was run. Among the things Goldberg believed about her background, or half believed in the way family stories tend to settle somewhere between fact and feeling, was the possibility of native ancestry. It was not a claim she pressed hard, but it was there, as it is in a remarkable number of African American families across every region of the country, a piece of inherited narrative that gets passed down alongside everything else and never quite gets examined. Gates's team examined it. The genetic results found no significant Native American ancestry in Goldberg's profile, not a buried trace that science had finally uncovered, an absence. And while that absence might seem like a simple correction, what it actually revealed was something more interesting than a yes or no answer about one woman's family tree. The belief in Native American ancestry is so common among African Americans that researchers studying the African American lives participants noted it as a pattern worth understanding in its own right. Almost universally, participants arrived expecting to find indigenous ancestry. Almost universally, the DNA did not confirm it. Gates addressed this directly in the series, not to dismiss the family stories, but to explain what had likely produced them. The explanations are several, and none of them are simple. In the antebellum South, free people of color and escaped enslaved people sometimes lived alongside indigenous communities, and genuine mixing did occur in specific regions and time periods. But the scale of that mixing was smaller than family tradition suggests. More significantly, certain physical features that families interpreted as markers of native ancestry, particular hair textures, bone structure, skin tone variation, have other genetic origins entirely, many of them African. The story, in other words, was built on real observation and a reasonable but incorrect interpretation of what that observation meant. What the absence confirmed, alongside everything else the results had already established, was that the picture emerging from Goldberg's DNA was more specific and more grounded than anything the family narrative had offered. The guesswork was being replaced, piece by piece, with something that could actually hold weight, and the most precise finding of all was still waiting. Mitochondrial DNA does not care about centuries. It passes from mother to child, unchanged, generation after generation, carrying a genetic signature that can reach back through time in ways that no document, no census record, and no family story ever could. Where autosomal DNA dilutes with each generation, halved, blended, eventually undetectable, mitochondrial DNA holds its shape. The maternal line it traces is direct and unbroken, a single thread running back through every mother's mother, stretching further than recorded history reaches. Goldberg's mitochondrial haplogroup placed her direct maternal line within a lineage rooted in West and Central Africa, consistent with the broader ancestral picture the autosomal results had already established, but reaching deeper into it. Not the era of the slave trade, not the colonial period, further back than that, into the ancient population movements that shaped the genetic landscape of the African continent itself, long before European ships appeared on the horizon. What that means in practical terms is this: the woman who built her public identity on an invented surname and an unverifiable origin story carries, in her maternal line, one of the oldest continuous human genetic signatures on Earth. Africa is where the human species originated. The deepest maternal lineages in existence are African ones. Goldberg's haplogroup does not make her unique in this. It connects her to a vast and ancient human story that predates every nation, every religion, and every boundary ever drawn on a map. The significance of that is easy to understate. In a culture that has spent centuries measuring African ancestry against European ancestry, treating one as heritage and the other as default, a finding like this reorients the frame entirely. The maternal line that runs through Whoopi Goldberg does not lead to a recent immigrant or a colonial settler or a displaced community of the last few hundred years. It leads to the origin point of human history itself. That is what science established. What remained, and what no haplogroup analysis, no subautosomal percentage, no genetic database could resolve, was the question of what any of it means to the person who carries it. The results taken together told a story that no family tradition had come close to capturing. Guinea-Bissau, Namibia, West and Central Africa across multiple distinct populations. A European ancestry that entered the bloodline not through choice but through the specific violence the institution of slavery made routine. A maternal haplogroup reaching back through thousands of years of human history to a continent that was never just a point of origin for Goldberg's family. It was the point of origin for everyone. The Caribbean story was gone. In its place was something far more specific, far more complex, and considerably harder to reduce to a single sentence. Goldberg has spoken about the experience of receiving those results, and what she has said is worth taking seriously. She did not describe it as a transformation. She did not emerge from the process with a new identity or a revised sense of self. What she described was closer to recognition, the feeling of having a suspicion confirmed, of seeing something she had always half known made legible at last. The blank space had not unmade her. Filling it in did not remake her either. That response says something important about the relationship between ancestry and identity that the science itself cannot address. DNA reveals origin. It does not determine belonging. The communities Goldberg's genome connects her to, the Papal, the Bajago, the unnamed West African peoples whose descendants were scattered across the Atlantic world, are not communities she grew up inside. The connection is real and it is meaningful, but it is not the same thing as lived experience, shared language, or inherited culture. Those were taken. The DNA survived. What she kept through all of it was the name. Whoopi Goldberg, invented, Jewish-sounding, chosen by a woman who wanted doors open, and kept by a woman who had long since stopped needing anyone to open doors for her. The genome tells one story, the name tells another. Both of them are true, and the tension between the two, between what we inherit and what we choose, is not a problem the science was ever going to resolve. What the DNA returned was a history that had been taken in impartial form, recovered. African ancestry is documented. The maternal line is ancient. The European presence is confirmed, and its origins, in all likelihood, are not innocent. What remains out of reach are the specific people, their names, their circumstances, the precise moments when lives intersected in ways that were rarely recorded, because recording them would have required acknowledging them. Science moved the line. It did not erase it. The name on her credits was always chosen. The blood was never consulted.